Sometimes the smallest words we say, the questions we ask without thinking, can change how people see us forever. This is the story of how one car ride, one photograph, and one misunderstanding nearly broke my closest friendship. I was 19, living in the dorms, and still adjusting to the peculiar rhythm of college life. The dorm was always noisy laughter spilling through thin walls, the constant thrum of music, the shuffling of feet in the hallway, doors slamming at odd hours. It felt like living in a hive where privacy was a rare luxury and everything about you, your habits, your quirks, your moods became part of the shared atmosphere despite the chaos. I liked it. There was something reassuring about being surrounded by so many people my own age, all trying to figure life out at the same time. I had my roommate, but more importantly, I had my closest friend on campus, a girl I'd known since the first week of freshman year. We lived just 2 doors apart, so our lives naturally intertwined. She became the person I ate with, studied with, and confided in. When our professor announced the semester project, a group assignment that would last weeks, maybe even months, I didn't think much of it. I assumed I'd be shuffled into a random group, make polite small talk, do my share of the work, and move on. That was how group projects usually went. But this time, I ended up in a group of 5, me, my friend, and 3 others. It didn't take long to realize that not all 5 of us carried equal weight. The group quickly split into 2 categories, the essential and the expendable. My friend and I were both essential because we cared enough to organize, to plan, to show up. And then there was him, the guy who would, in ways I couldn't predict then, change the texture of everything. He wasn't the loudest or the most charismatic. If anything, he seemed laid back, the kind of person who didn't get rattled easily. He lived off campus, which already set him apart from me and my friend, who rarely ventured beyond the safe bubble of the dorm. He also had a car, which, at 19, was more than just a vehicle. It was a kind of freedom, a mark of independence. The other 2 group members faded into the background quickly. They contributed here and there, but they weren't central. It became clear that the core of the project would revolve around me, my friend, and him. At first, I didn't know what to make of him. He wasn't particularly talkative, but when he spoke, he chose his words carefully, as if weighing them. He laughed easily at jokes, but not in a way that felt forced. There was a steadiness to him that contrasted sharply with my own nervous energy. I was still learning how to carry myself in these new adult spaces, trying not to let insecurity seep through. He seemed past all that, as if he had already figured himself out. Our professor gave us some vague instructions, nothing too detailed, which meant a lot of the responsibility fell on us to figure things out. That was how we learned we'd have to meet outside of campus to work on parts of the project, places where we could spread out materials, talk without interruption, maybe even use equipment that wasn't available at school. For me and my friend, that presented a challenge. Neither of us had cars. We lived in the dorms, walked everywhere, relied on buses or rides when necessary. It made us feel a little trapped sometimes, like the world was moving faster for everyone else. That's when he offered, "Look, it's easier if I just pick you 2 up," he said during one of our group chats. "I'll drive us to meet the others. It makes more sense than you trying to figure out buses or whatever." It was simple, logical, generous. But to me, it felt bigger than that. It was someone extending a hand across the invisible line that separated those who could drive anywhere at will and those of us who couldn't. I agreed quickly, maybe too eagerly. My friend didn't protest either. though later I would wonder if she had reservations from the start. The arrangement was set. He would pick us up from the dorms and take us to wherever the group needed to meet. It sounded straightforward. At the time, I had no idea how much weight those car rides would carry. The first time he pulled up, it was a cool afternoon, sunlight slanting across the dorm parking lot. His car was small, a two-door coupe that looked almost snug, intimate compared to the bigger, practical vehicles some students drove. I slid into the passenger seat. My friend climbed into the back, and suddenly it was just the three of us, enclosed in a small capsule of space that felt removed from everything else. It's hard to describe the strangeness of that moment. Sitting next to him, so close, aware of the small details, the way his hands gripped the steering wheel, the faint scent of his cologne, the low hum of the engine. I felt both awkward and oddly calm. The dorm noise, the chatter of campus life, all of it disappeared once the car doors closed. I tried to make small talk, to fill the silence. But it was one of those silences that wasn't uncomfortable until you noticed it. He didn't seem bothered by it. He drove with quiet confidence, eyes fixed on the road, one hand casually resting on the gear shift. That was when I noticed it. The photograph that was clipped to the sun visor above him, a small Polaroid of him and a girl. They were close together in the picture, smiling in that unguarded way people do when they're happy and not thinking about how they look. She had her arm looped through his, leaning in like she belonged there. I couldn't help myself. The words slipped out before I could think. "Oh, that's cute. Is that your girlfriend?" He glanced at me briefly, then back at the road. "Yeah." His voice was calm, even. Then, as if to underline it, he pulled down his own visor and revealed another Polaroid tucked there. I laughed lightly, the kind of laugh meant to be friendly, to acknowledge something sweet. "That's really cute," I said again, maybe too enthusiastically. It was meant to be nothing more than small talk, a way of connecting. We were going to be working together for weeks, maybe months. It made sense to get to know each other, to ask about the people who mattered to him. At least, that's how I saw it. But in the back seat, I felt my friend's silence like a shadow. She didn't chime in, didn't laugh with me, didn't add to the conversation. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I assumed she was just tired or distracted. I had no idea that she was already interpreting everything differently. For me, it was simple curiosity. For her, it was something else entirely. The ride continued, the afternoon light flickering through the trees as we left campus behind. I remember the way the shadows moved across the dashboard, across his hands on the wheel. I remember the faint rattle in the back whenever we hit a bump, like something loose in the trunk. Ordinary details, really, but when I look back now, they glow brighter in memory, as if everything that happened later somehow charged those moments with significance. I thought asking about his girlfriend was harmless, maybe even polite. People often liked talking about the ones they loved. It gave them a chance to smile, to soften. And I wanted him to soften. I wanted to break through the quiet, to find some thread of connection we could use for the weeks ahead. So, I asked after a pause, "How long have you been together?" He didn't hesitate. "A little over a year. That's nice," I said, nodding. "Did you meet here?" "On campus." Another quick glance in my direction, then back to the road. "No, we went to the same high school." There was nothing unusual in his answers. They were short, but not unfriendly. I kept going, maybe pushing further than I should have. "What's she studying?" "Does she go here too?" "No," he said. "She's at another school, A couple hours away. I smiled, even though he wasn't looking. Long distance, huh? That must be tough. It works, he said simply. I didn't push after that. I let the conversation settle into the hum of the tires on asphalt. But inside, I felt a flicker of satisfaction. I'd managed to draw him out, even if just a little. I thought it was progress. From the back seat, though, I could sense my friend shifting. She hadn't spoken since we'd left the dorm. I couldn't see her face clearly, but I could feel her disapproval, quiet but heavy. I told myself I was imagining it. The car itself fascinated me more than it should have. Maybe because I wasn't used to being in cars anymore. Living in the dorms, walking everywhere, relying on buses, it made every car ride feel like a novelty. His car, small as it was, carried its own atmosphere. The seats were worn but clean, the air faintly scented with pine from a little air freshener dangling by the vent. Music played low, something indie and unfamiliar, just enough to fill the space without demanding attention. I found myself cataloguing the details. The way the visor was slightly cracked where the clip held the photo. The way his hoodie sleeve bunched near his wrist as he gripped the wheel. The way sunlight caught on the edges of the Polaroid like it was glowing. It felt intimate in a way I hadn't anticipated. Too intimate, maybe, for a first car ride with someone I barely knew. But I didn't see it that way then. I just thought of it as curiosity, observation. The way I tried to make sense of people. When we arrived at the coffee shop where the rest of the group was waiting, I hopped out of the passenger seat and held the door so my friend could climb out from the back. She brushed past me without a word, her expression tight, unreadable. I told myself she was just tired, or maybe stressed about the project. I had no idea then that she had already begun to draw conclusions I hadn't even considered. The meeting itself was uneventful. We spread out our laptops and notebooks, ordered drinks, and went through the motions of planning. The two less involved members nodded along, offering ideas when prompted. He sat across from me, leaning back in his chair, speaking only when necessary. My friend sat beside me, her presence unusually cold, like a wall I couldn't see over. I tried not to think about it. I focused on the project, on making lists and assigning tasks. But every so often, my eyes drifted back to him, his quiet concentration. The way he sipped his drink without hurry, the faint smirk he gave when one of the others cracked a joke. He seemed comfortable in a way I envied. By the time we finished and packed up, the sky had darkened. He offered again to drive us back. My friend and I followed him out to the parking lot. The second ride was quieter. I didn't ask about his girlfriend this time. I told myself I didn't want to push too far, that I didn't want to come across as nosy. But in truth, I was distracted by the shift in my friend's demeanor. She sat in the back, arms crossed, gaze fixed out the window. I tried to bridge the silence with small talk about the project, about classes, about the weather, but it felt forced. He answered politely, but without elaboration. The only sound that filled the car was the music, soft and steady, and the occasional click of the turn signal. When we reached the dorms, I thanked him. My friend didn't. She climbed out quickly, muttering a quiet bye that didn't sound like her at all. I watched her walk inside without waiting for me. Something in my chest tightened, though I couldn't name it then. That night, in the dorm, I asked her what was wrong. "What do you mean?" She said, too quickly, "You've been quiet all day. You barely said a word in the car." She hesitated, then looked at me with something sharp in her eyes. "Do you even realize how weird you were acting?" I blinked. Weird how, with him, in the car, asking about his girlfriend like that. I frowned. I was just making conversation. Her laugh was short, humorless. You don't ask questions like that unless you're trying to flirt. Do you think it didn't sound obvious? Because it did. It was. Gross. The word stung, sharper than I expected. What? No, that's not Tive, wasn't flirting. I was just being friendly. We're going to be working with him for weeks. I thought it would help too. To what? She cut in. To get closer to him. To make sure he knows you're interested. Do you have any idea how it looked? I opened my mouth, then closed it again. I hadn't considered, not even once, how it might have looked. To me, it had been innocent curiosity. To her, it had been something else entirely. Would you have asked those questions if his girlfriend was in the car with us? She demanded. I faltered. I don't know, maybe. Probably I'd have asked her instead. Her expression hardened. Exactly. You wouldn't. You only asked because she wasn't there. Do you see how that comes across? I shook my head, frustrated. No, I don't. I wasn't thinking like that. You're blowing this way out of proportion. She crossed her arms, leaning back in her chair. Maybe, or maybe you just don't realize what you're doing. The words lodged deep, even as I tried to dismiss them. I told her she was overreacting, that it was ridiculous to call me disgusting for asking a few questions. She rolled her eyes, muttered something under her breath, and walked out of the room. I sat there long after she left, staring at the wall, replaying the conversation in my head. For the first time, a seed of doubt took root. Had I crossed a line without realizing it? The days that followed were strange. The project continued, but the air between us had changed. My friend was distant, cool. She still showed up for meetings, still did her part, but her warmth toward me had dimmed. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just stress, but the truth was harder to ignore. She looked at me differently now, as if she couldn't unsee what she thought she'd seen in that car. I started to question myself more than I cared to admit when I replayed the car ride in my mind. It did sound different, almost suspicious. If I stripped away my own intentions, the way I'd laughed, the way I'd pressed for details, it could, maybe, be mistaken for flirting, but I knew what I'd meant. I knew the place I'd been speaking from, a simple desire to connect, to make the silence less heavy. Why couldn't she see that? That tension followed us into every meeting after. I noticed the way she avoided eye contact with me, the way she sometimes positioned herself closer to the others. I noticed how her voice turned sharp when she addressed me, even over small things. And I noticed something else, to how being in the car with him again, even after her accusations, carried its own strange weight. The photographs were still there, clipped to the visors, smiling down like silent witnesses. I found myself staring at them, not because I was interested in her, not because I envied him, but because they represented something I couldn't name. Stability, maybe. A kind of certainty about who you belonged to, and who belonged to you. I didn't have that, and maybe my friend sensed it, even if I didn't. That was how the first cracks formed. Not in the project, we were still functional enough as a group, but in the friendship I thought was unshakable, all because of a few questions, spoken without thought, in the confined space of a small car, and because sometimes what you mean and how you sound are two entirely different things. The next time we met, I told myself I wouldn't bring up his girlfriend. I told myself I'd be careful with my words, careful with my tone. But once you've been accused of something once, someone close to you has suggested, you're crossing lines you didn't even know existed, changes the way you move through the world. Found myself second-guessing everything. If I laughed too loudly, would it sound flirtatious? If I asked a question, would it sound too curious? Even silence felt risky, as if my quiet could be misread as some kind of longing. And so, the car rides became heavier. He didn't change much. He still drove with the same relaxed posture, one hand on the wheel, eyes steady on the road. He still spoke sparingly, his words measured but not unfriendly. If he noticed the tension between me and my friend in the back seat, he didn't mention it. Maybe he assumed it was unrelated to him. Maybe he didn't care. But for me, every detail became magnified. The way the sun caught on the Polaroid photos, the way his voice shifted slightly when he said her name, the way my friend's silence pressed into me from the back seat, louder than any words. I tried to keep conversation safe, neutral. I asked about the project, about deadlines, about who was handling which section. I asked about classes, about professors we both shared. I even asked about music, commenting on the playlist he kept low on the stereo. He answered each time with that same steady calm. But my friend still said nothing, or almost nothing. Her silence had become a verdict, a constant reminder that in her eyes, I had already crossed a line. One afternoon, after another meeting at the coffee shop, we got back into his car. I was exhausted, my head buzzing with lists of tasks and upcoming exams. I leaned my head against a cool window, letting the hum of the engine fill my mind. That was when he spoke first. "You live in the dorms, right?" I turned to him, surprised. "Yeah? Why?" He shrugged slightly, eyes on the road. "Just wondering. I never did. I moved straight off campus. I guess it's a different experience." I nodded. "It is loud, messy, crowded, but I like it, mostly. Feels like being part of something." He smiled faintly. "Yeah, I can see that." The conversation drifted after that, but it stuck with me. Maybe because it was one of the few times he initiated. One of the few glimpses of him beyond the quiet surface. I wanted more of that. I wanted to understand him, the way he seemed so grounded, so unbothered, and maybe that was the problem. Maybe my curiosity, my desire to draw him out, was what my friend read as something else. That evening, back at the dorm, my friend finally broke the silence. "Do you like him?" she asked abruptly as we sat in the common room. The question hit me like cold water. "What? No, of course not." She raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "Then why do you act like that around him?" "Like what?" I asked, exasperated. "Like you're trying to get his attention. Like you care more about what he thinks than anyone else in the group." I shook my head, frustrated. I don't know. I'm trying to make this project easier. He's important to it. I'm just trying to connect, that's all." Her voice was sharp. "It doesn't look like that. It looks like you're trying to get close to someone who's already taken. And it's gross." There it was again. That word, gross. It stung more each time she used it, because it reduced everything I felt, all my confusion, all my attempts to connect, into something ugly and shameful. I snapped, "You know what? You can stop with the nonsense." I wasn't flirting. I wasn't trying to steal anyone. "You're making this into something it isn't." Her eyes narrowed. Am I, or are you just too blind to admit what you're doing? I stood, anger rising in my chest. If you really think I'm that kind of person, then maybe you don't know me as well as I thought. She didn't answer. She just looked away, her silence louder than any reply. The days blurred after that. We kept meeting for the project, kept riding in his car, kept pretending nothing was wrong. But the tension was always there, an invisible thread pulling at everything. Sometimes I caught him glancing at me in the car, as if sensing something unsaid. Sometimes I thought about asking him directly if I seemed strange, if my questions had bothered him. But I never did. The risk of confirming my friend's suspicions was too high. Instead, I stayed quiet. I let the silence grow, but silence doesn't erase things. It only lets them fester. One night, lying awake in my dorm bed, I replayed everything in my mind. The first ride, the photographs, my questions, my friend's sharp words. Had I been blind? Had there been something in my tone, in the way I leaned too close, in the way I laughed? Something that betrayed more than I realized. I told myself no. I told myself it was all innocent, that she was projecting her own judgments onto me. But doubt gnawed at me anyway, and beneath the doubt, something else. A quiet, unsettling thought I couldn't fully face. Maybe she wasn't entirely wrong. Maybe there was something about him that drew me in, not in the way she thought. Not as desire, but as something I couldn't name. Admiration, envy, a longing for the steadiness he carried so effortlessly. I didn't know. I only knew that her accusation had planted a seed I couldn't stop tending, no matter how much I wanted to ignore it. The project moved forward. Deadlines approached. We worked, we met, we planned. From the outside, everything looked fine, but inside, everything had shifted. The car rides became metaphors, confined spaces, unspoken words, silent witnesses in the form of photographs clipped to visors. My friend's silence in the back seat. My own nervous attempts at conversation. His steady presence at the wheel, calm and inscrutable, and the growing awareness that sometimes the story people tell about you isn't the one you believe you're living. The night before one of our biggest project deadlines, my friend confronted me again. "Do you even hear yourself?" she asked, her voice tight with frustration. "Do you realize how you sound?" I sighed, exhausted. "I don't know what you want from me. I told you I wasn't flirting. I wasn't trying to do anything." She looked at me for a long moment, then shook her head. "I just don't trust it. I don't trust you around him. And maybe I don't trust you the way I used to, either." Those words landed heavier than any accusation before. I didn't answer. I couldn't, because in that moment, I realized the truth. Even if I hadn't meant it, even if my intentions were clean, the damage was already done. Her version of the story had already taken root. And once someone believes a story about you, it's almost impossible to rewrite it. The next day, I sat in his car again, staring at the Polaroids. Two small photographs, clipped casually to visors, meant to be nothing more than reminders of someone he loved. But to me, they had become symbols of everything that had unraveled. My friend's distrust, my own self-doubt, the fragile line between innocence and perception. I wanted to reach up, to take them down, to erase the reminder. But of course, I couldn't. They weren't mine. They were his, so I sat in silence, hands folded in my lap, watching the road stretch out before us, wondering how something so small a photograph, a few questions, could leave such a long shadow. That was part one, the beginning of a story that would follow me for weeks, maybe months, a story about perception, misunderstanding, and the way friendship can fracture not from betrayal, but from suspicion alone. I wish I could tell you the tension disappeared after the project ended, that once we submitted the final paper, once the grade was posted, everything between us's long silences, the sharp words, the weight of suspicions simply dissolved. But that isn't how it went. Projects end. Friendships don't always heal the day of our final presentation. I remember sitting at the table in the classroom, papers spread in front of me, the projector humming. My friend sat to my left, flipping through her slides without looking at me. He sat at the end of the row, calm as always, the quiet anchor he had been from the beginning. We delivered our parts smoothly. The professor nodded, impressed. We smiled politely as the class clapped. From the outside, it looked like success, but inside, I felt hollow, because even as we stood together in front of the screen, I knew that what had once been simple three people working toward the same goal was gone. What remained was fractured trust, bruised pride, and words I could never take back. Afterward, he drove us one last time. It was strange, stepping into the car, knowing it would be the last ride. The Polaroids still hung from the visors, edges curled slightly from the sun. My friend slipped into the back seat without a word. I buckled in, my chest tight. The drive was quiet, almost eerily so. No music this time. Just the hum of the engine and the occasional turn signal clicking. When we reached campus, I opened the door quickly, eager to escape the heaviness. But before I stepped out, I glanced at him. "Thanks," I said softly. "For driving, for everything." He gave a small nod. "Take care," that was it. 2 words. Take care. I wanted to ask if I had ever made him uncomfortable, if he had noticed the tension, if he understood the accusations that had hung between me and my friend because of him. But I did instead. I shut the door and walked away. Weeks passed. Life moved on. New classes, new projects, new people. But the shadow of that time lingered. My friend and I still spoke, but something essential had been lost. Our conversations stayed shallow, careful. The warmth we'd shared before never fully returned. Every so often, I caught her watching me, as if still searching for signs of something she hadn't been able to prove, and he faded into the background of my life, as people sometimes do. I passed him once or twice on campus, exchanged polite nods. Nothing more. It was almost as if he had been a figure in a short story, stepping in for a few chapters before exiting quietly, leaving behind only the echoes of what his presence had stirred. But here's the truth I've had to face. The part I avoided for so long. My friend wasn't entirely wrong. I didn't want him. Not in the way she thought. Not in the way she accused. But there was something in me that leaned toward him, something that admired his steadiness, that longed for the calm he carried, and maybe that longing unspoken, unconscious, was enough for her to sense, enough for her to name it in the harshest way she could. It doesn't matter that my intentions were innocent. Intentions don't always protect you from perception. Sometimes the story people tell about you outweighs the one you tell yourself. What I learned is this: trust is fragile. Once cracked, it doesn't return to its original shape. You can glue it back together, but the seams remain. And perception. Perception has a weight of its own. It can shape reality, shift relationships, change the way people see you. even if you never meant for any of it to happen. I learned that silence can wound as much as words. That suspicion can fracture bonds more deeply than betrayal itself. That sometimes we lose people not because of what we did, but because of what they believed we were capable of, and perhaps most painfully, I learned that we don't always get the chance to rewrite the story others hold about us. Looking back now, I think about those Polaroid photographs, small squares of paper hanging casually from visors, reminders of someone who wasn't even there. They were meant to be simple, but for me, they became symbols of perception, of misunderstanding, of the way love and loyalty can hover in the background, shaping how every gesture is red dot to photographs, and everything unraveled. If there's a lesson in all this, it's not about avoiding people or silencing curiosity. It's not about walking on eggshells forever, afraid of what others might think. It's about remembering that every interaction carries weight, that even when you mean nothing more than friendliness, others may see something else, that your story is never yours alone. It is always filtered through the eyes of those who watch you, and maybe, just maybe, it's about forgiveness, learning to forgive yourself for what you didn't mean, and forgiving others for the stories they needed to tell in order to protect themselves. I don't know if my friend and I will ever return to what we were. I don't know if he even remembers me, or if I was just another passenger in a car he drove for a few weeks one semester. But I do know this: every now and then, when I'm sitting in someone else's car, I glance at the dashboard. I notice the little details, the photos, the trinkets, the pieces of someone's life displayed casually, without thought, and I think about how those tiny, ordinary things can become symbols, how they can spark stories we never meant to write. I think about how fragile trust is, how perception shapes us, and I remind myself to be careful, not in a fearful way, but in a mindful one, because sometimes the smallest details linger the longest. Sometimes the story that changes you forever doesn't begin with a betrayal, or a kiss, or even a choice. Sometimes it begins with nothing more than a photograph hanging from a visor in someone else's car. The strange thing about endings is that they rarely announce themselves. You don't wake up one morning to find a bold sign across your day that says, "This is the conclusion. From here forward, things will be different." No endings seep in quietly, like fog at dawn. You only realize later, when you look back, that a chapter has already closed while you were still turning the page. That's how it was after the project. At first, I thought the silence was temporary. I told myself my friend just needed time, that her words sharp, accusing were things she'd regret once her emotions cooled. I assumed that, after a week or two, she'd laugh again at my jokes, slump beside me in the dining hall, nudge my shoulder with that casual closeness that comes only from years of friendship. But silence has a way of solidifying. What begins as a pause becomes a pattern. Days passed, and though we still spoke, it was never the same. She was polite, civil, always careful, as if every word had to be checked twice before it left her lips. The playful, easy rhythm of our conversations was gone. I could feel it each time we talked, the restraint, the unspoken wall, and the worst part, I didn't know how to break it. Walking across campus, I caught myself remembering tiny things, the way she used to wave her fork around in the cafeteria when she was excited about a story, or the way her voice dropped low when she was gossiping, half afraid someone might overhear. Those small intimacies were now sealed off, like photographs from a past life. I wanted to ask her, Do you still think I was flirting? Do you still believe I was trying to wedge myself between him and his girlfriend? But the words never came. I was afraid of the answer, afraid that the suspicion hadn't left her, that it still clung to her view of me like a permanent stain. So instead, I stayed silent too. We spoke about assignments, about schedules, about the mundane details of daily life. We avoided the past. We avoided honesty. And in that avoidance, the distance grew. It wasn't only between us, either. I felt it everywhere when I walked into class and saw him at the far end of the room. Calm and collected, as always, I hesitated. I didn't know whether to wave, to nod, to pretend I hadn't noticed. Usually, I settled for the smallest acknowledgement, quick glance, a flicker of recognition before sinking into my chair and focusing too hard on my notes. I never knew what he thought of me, whether he noticed the tension, whether he sensed that his photographs had been the spark that lit the whole fire. Maybe to him, I was just another face in the group, a minor character who had overstepped, however briefly, and then receded into the background. But to me, he had become something else entirely, a mirror, not because of who he was, but because of what his presence reflected back at my own insecurities, my longing for acceptance, my desperate need to be seen as harmless, trustworthy, safe. Every time I glimpsed him, I wondered if he knew the story my friend had woven around me. If he believed it too, nights in the dorm were the hardest. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, the hum of distant laughter drifting down the hall. My mind replayed everything. The moment I leaned forward in his car to look at the Polaroid, the tone of my voice when I said, "That's cute," the string of questions that followed. I hadn't thought twice in the moment. I'd only wanted to be friendly, to fill the silence, to show genuine interest in someone else's life. But under the microscope of my friend's suspicion, every word now looked like evidence. I asked myself, endlessly, was my voice too soft, too warm? Did I linger too long? Did I smile in a way that could be misread? The questions ate at me. And the more I tried to convince myself of my innocence, the more I doubted. Because isn't that the cruelest part of suspicion? Even when you're falsely accused, you start to see yourself through the accuser's eyes. You start to question your own memory, your own motives. And so, lying there in the dark, I felt caught in a paradox, guilty of nothing, yet guilty all the same. I noticed how quickly the world adjusts when relationships shift in the dining hall. She no longer saved me a seat. In group chats, her replies were shorter, punctuated only by what was necessary. At study sessions, her laughter bent toward others instead of me. None of it was cruel. None of it was dramatic. But that was what made it worse. It wasn't rejection, it was erasure. It was as if she'd redrawn the map of her life. And where I once occupied a familiar place, there was now just empty space, and I didn't know how to climb back in. I tried to fill the void elsewhere. I spent more time with classmates I barely knew, forced myself into conversations, lingered in lounges with people I'd never have approached before. I laughed louder, tried harder, told myself that if one friendship faltered, I'd build others. But no matter how many faces surrounded me, I carried the absence of hers like a shadow. There are some people whose presence in your life cannot simply be substituted. They hold history with you. They know the roots beneath the surface. Losing them feels less like losing a friend and more like losing a part of yourself. And I had lost her not all at once, but piece by piece, each silence carving away another sliver of what we used to be. The campus moved toward spring. Trees budded, pathways grew crowded again. The air carried that restless energy of change, but inside me, the season never shifted. I remained in winter cold, barren, waiting for something that would not return. One afternoon, I spotted her across the quad. She was laughing with another girl, her hair catching the sunlight, her expression bright. For a moment, I felt a pang so sharp it stole my breath. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't anger. It was mourning the fact that I was no longer the one she shared that easy laughter with. Mourning the fact that I had become an outsider to her joy. And as I stood there, watching from a distance, I realized the silence between us had become permanent. It was no longer a pause waiting to be broken, it was the new reality. The project had ended, but its shadow lingered. And in that shadow, I found myself learning, slowly, painfully, what it means to lose without closure. Silence doesn't announce itself as an ending, but when you live inside it long enough, you come to understand it is. And so, in those weeks after the project, I began to accept a truth I hadn't wanted to face sometimes. There is no mending. Sometimes, the fracture is the finale, even if no one ever says goodbye. Silence did not end with the project. It followed me like a shadow at first. I thought it was temporary, a pause, a lull. The kind of quiet that comes after long days of collaboration, when everyone just needs time to breathe again. But as the days became weeks, and the weeks stretched into a month, I realized it wasn't a pause at all. It was an ending disguised as absence. Walking through campus, I would sometimes catch sight of her across the courtyard or in the dining hall. We didn't avoid each other deliberately, not in any dramatic way, but the distance was there. She would be laughing with someone else, her face animated, her hands moving as though the air itself had to carry her words farther. I would watch, waiting for the flicker of recognition, some signal that the bond we'd had was still alive, however faint. But her eyes never found me, and so silence became my companion at night. In the dorm room, I would replay those car rides in my head. The cramped space of the two-door vehicle, the warmth of the sun through the windshield, the photographs clipped to the visor. I had thought so little of it than just a conversation, just a moment. But in memory, it grew heavier, like a stone I carried in my chest. Not because of what I had done, but because of what it had cost. There is a unique ache in being misunderstood. It is not like guilt, where you know you've crossed a line and now must pay. And it is not like grief, where something precious is taken beyond your control. It is something stranger, more elusive. The sense of standing on one side of a glass wall, screaming your truth while on the other side, someone you care about watches your lips move and decides to believe a different story. That was the silence I lived with. The project ended, but the memory did not. The grade came in, we all passed, and in theory, that should have been closure. Yet closure is not about grades or deadlines. It's about people, and the silence between us lingered like an unfinished sentence. Sometimes I would draft messages late at night. Hey, I know things got weird. I just want you to know I never meant it that way. Or, I hope we can talk sometime. I miss how easy it used to be, but I never pressed send. Every time my thumb hovered over the button, doubt pulled me back. What if she laughed? What if she showed someone else, twisting my words into another joke about me being desperate or creepy? The thought paralyzed me. So instead, I let silence speak for me. Yet silence is not neutral. It grows, it multiplies. It fills the spaces where conversation might have healed, until eventually it becomes the only language left. I began to wonder if perhaps this was adulthood, the quiet unraveling of friendships, not through betrayal or rage, but through small misunderstandings left unattended, like a crack in a wall that no one bothers to fix until the whole structure collapses, and still I carried the weight of it. There were moments when I convinced myself it didn't matter. After all, we were just two people in a project group, not family, not lifelong friends, just temporary allies brought together by circumstance. But then I would remember the way she had once smiled at me across a library table, rolling her eyes at some joke the professor made, or the way she had leaned in close during a study session, whispering something that made us both laugh until we had to cover our mouths to keep from disturbing everyone else. Those were not the marks of just temporary. Those were the beginnings of trust. And so the silence hurt. In time, though, I began to see it differently. Silence was not just an absence. It was a mirror. It forced me to face questions I might never have asked otherwise. Who am I when others misunderstand me? How much of myself do I owe to correcting their perception? At what point does explanation become begging? And when is it more dignified to let go? These were not questions I wanted, but they were the questions I needed. I found myself writing more journals, long letters I never sent, essays that began as ramblings, but turned into something deeper. The page became my companion where my friend no longer was. I poured into words the things I couldn't say aloud, the ache of being misread, the longing for reconciliation, the stubborn hope that maybe, one day, she would look back and realize I had only ever wanted to be kind. And in that process, silence shifted. It stopped being an enemy and became a teacher. It taught me patience, the kind that stretches beyond minutes or days, the kind that holds steady even when resolution never comes. It taught me humility, reminding me that my perspective, no matter how clear to me, is never the only one in the room. And it taught me resilience, the quiet strength of carrying on, even when part of your story is left untold. Still, late at night, when the campus lights flickered and the halls grew quiet, I would feel it, the weight of what